You'll hear from historian Stanley Karnow, Elsa Walsh of The New Yorker, The Washington Post's David Maraniss, and Christopher Hitchens of The Nation and Vanity Fair. Then the story behind Man of the Century, the life and times of Pope John Paul II. Author Jonathan Whitney talks about his most recent book. Now former Booknotes authors, including historian Stanley Karnow and journalists Elsa Walsh, David Maraniss, and Christopher Hitchens, talk about their current projects, what they read, and the life of a writer. This discussion is moderated by Brian Lamb of C-SPAN, who's the host of Booknotes. They spoke at Bibelo, a bookstore just outside Baltimore, Maryland.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thanks to Bibelo on this Sunday afternoon when there are all kinds of things going on, including a miserable rainy day, that you all came out today and that our authors came all the way up here from Washington. Today took a little bit longer, about an hour and a half drive, so thank you very much for going out of your way. You never know quite what to do at an event like this to get things started, but I went into the book and read the 4 excerpts from our 4 authors and tried to find something that would get us started here. And I think that maybe one of the best things I found was kind of a dispute between Stanley Karnow and Christopher Hitchens about whether or not they like to write. I found a quote in Christopher Hitchens' excerpt that says, "I hate not writing." And Stanley Karnow says, if I can find it here, and I can't, of course, "I don't know any writer who thinks that writing is fun." And then you've got George Will in the book that says, "If I'm not writing, I'm miserable." And, you know, that's not an exact quote. So why don't we start with, down at the end with Christopher Hitchens, come right down the row and ask each of our authors just to talk about writing and what it's like for them. Mr. Hitchens?
Some people, I think, when I talk at what are sometimes called creative writing classes, having first established from the university what other kinds of writing it is that they're trying to teach out there, I always begin by saying, well, there are people who think they might like to write, or who think that it's a great profession, or perhaps a noble career, or a fine calling, this and that, although some of them have been told by their families they'll never make a living at it, and when are they going to get a real job, and so forth. But there are also people, I then go on to say, who feel that they have to write, that they write because they must write. And then I look to see if anyone looks up suddenly, as if to sort of catch my eye. And then that's the person I try and get hold of afterwards when it's time to go to the pub, because there's been that shock of recognition. They think, oh, how do you know? How did you know that's why I came here? It can sound both, if you like, probably does sound both pompous and vaguely demented to say that you're under a compulsion to write. But it does make sense to some people some of the time. I've noticed there may even be some people nodding in a sinister fashion in this audience, like a sort of Charles Adams cackle rippling through. Yes, yes, I've got to do it too. But that's the fact of the matter. I hate to agree with George Will about this, or indeed about anything else, or anything else indeed. But the truth is, yes, there's nothing like not writing for making you unhappy. And if you have the compulsion, then the only problem that you'll have as you surrender to this compulsion more and more is that you'll find that it gets harder the more you do it. Now that seems a shame. It should get easier. It should become more like a facility, for example. But it becomes more difficult, and it becomes more difficult because you are reading more and more work by better and better people, and you've lost the sheer nerve and blind solipsism that allowed you to think you could try it when you were young before you had made any proper comparisons. So it gets much more nerve-wracking and much more difficult and in every way costly for you, and no doubt for your readers as time inches by.
Mr. Maraniss?
Well, I can think of a few things that I enjoy more than writing, and when I was a kid, there were only 2 things that I was any good at. One was playing shortstop, and the other was writing, and I wasn't good enough to play shortstop for the Cleveland Indians, so I became a writer. And I grew up in a family of newspaper people and editors, so it was almost second nature to me, and I was the dumbest of my siblings, and so they all became professors, and I became another newspaper man. But I do love writing, and having made the transition from writing for a newspaper daily for many, many years to writing projects for a newspaper where I'd write once every few months to now writing books where it might take 2 or 3 years. And in this case, I'm researching a book that I haven't written a word about yet, and I'm more than a year into it. And so it's a different process of waiting to write. But now I am itching to start writing this book, and I love it when I'm up in that room writing.
And what is that book, and when will it come out?
The book is a social biography of Vince Lombardi. It's a study of leadership and character, again, and also of the creation of an American myth, using the thread of religion, military, and football to write about modern American life, and using Vince Lombardi as the character. And it was a delight to research. My wife and I moved to Green Bay for 3 months to start it out last winter, which doesn't sound delightful, but it really was. And lived in New York all summer because he was a New Yorker. Actually spent 46 of his 57 years in New York. And just got back from Italy, where we traced his roots.
And it does help that you were born in Madison?
That's probably why I turned to Lombardi as the sports figure that I was interested in, because he was an icon of my younger days, yeah.
Before we leave, Christopher Hitchens, are you writing a book now?
Well, I wouldn't say I liked it that much. I mean, I like sort of doing it. I more and more find that I like the pace and rhythm of magazine writing, I've got to say. And of writing the kind of feuilleton piece. I've got to write one tonight, actually. And I'm looking forward to getting back to doing it. You know, I know even if I get back late and after dinner and so on, even if I'm tired, I have a rough idea of how I want it to go. I know what my readers are like. This is a nation piece. I sort of know how to talk to them. I can't believe I'm getting paid for it.
We can work on that if you'd like. Let's go to Elsa Walsh. How about writing?
No, which is just as well, yes.
I'm so disappointed, Christopher, to hear that it's only the people who love to write that get to go to the bar with you, because I think I'm more in Stanley's category. When I first began writing, I loved the process of writing, and then what I really realized as I became a newspaper reporter and started out doing that way, what I really loved to do was the research. And for me, that's what's the most fun, and it's very difficult to actually sit down at the end and begin to organize what I want to say and think what I want to say, and oftentimes I have to write many drafts before I get to that point where I know what it is that I do want to say. And so for me, what I think are the two things that are most fun about writing is the research and the rewriting, not the first step of the writing.
What's the difference, while we're there, what's the difference between writing for the Washington Post, the book, and now the New Yorker?
Well, with the book, I could spend as much time as I wanted, so that was a lot of fun. Writing for the Washington Post taught me to be quick. It taught me to be accurate. It taught me to dig deep. Writing the book was a completely different process in which I spent years and years, whereas at the Washington Post, sometimes I'd spend an hour writing a piece. And working for the New Yorker, for me, is sort of a nice midpoint between those two, because when you write a piece for the New Yorker, it's like writing a little mini book, but you get it out and you don't have to market it and you don't have to sell it.
Stanley Carnot, before we go any farther, is it Carnot or Carnot?
Carnot.
Carnot.
Like Moscow.
But in our discussion on book notes, you talked about the New Yorker, and you talked about one of your dreams writing for the New Yorker.
Yeah, and I tried a piece for the New Yorker a couple of years ago. They paid me very handsomely and everything. It didn't seem to work, but that's maybe it was my fault, probably. Yeah, the New Yorker is a good place to work, and I envy you going there. I'm a great New Yorker fan from my college days, which was long before most of you were born. Pardon me, but when I thought the New Yorker was like the New York Yankees, you know, when Harold Ross was the editor, and I would have given anything to have been one of those writers.
What about writing? You know, we start off with your quote.
I'm going to tell you, I think that if you enjoy writing, you're doing something wrong. I agree with Elsa. The research part is lovely. I mean, that's fun. And you go off and if you're a vacuum cleaner researcher like I am, you go with a tape recorder, and you got a zillion times more material than you can possibly use in a book. And then you got to start cutting it down, and you got to make these decisions about what you're going to use, what you're going to throw away. And everything is so good that throwing away stuff is very difficult. I don't know whether Hemingway said it to me. I'm name dropping because he did talk to me in part of my book here. I must say that, just to digress for a moment, everything he said to me during the course of our conversation, that report, he said to people 1,000 times before. There was nothing original about it. But at that stage in his life, he was getting old and garrulous and drunk most of the time. But he said that, you know, the art of writing is knowing what to throw away. But he himself had great trouble doing it, and at one stage he had to cut 60,000 words out of a book, and he couldn't do it, so they had to hire someone to do the cutting for him. But then you get to the process of, after you've done your research and you've read the things and you've got a whole wall of books you're cribbing from and interviews and newspaper clippings and all, and then you start organizing it, and then you start writing it, and that's where it becomes horrible. Because you know, I want to say another thing. It's a whole new subject. I don't want to go too far into it. Writing on a computer has improved your writing, but makes it also more difficult because you can change so easily. So you become obsessed. You wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you go down to I work in my cellar. You stick that adjective in, right? And you look at maybe another. Then you get the thesaurus out. You look through it. Maybe there's another adjective. So you hang out down there for an hour or so, then you go back to sleep if you can. You wake up in the morning, you look at it, says, nah, stinks. Cut the adjectives out. And so this obsession, compulsion, to go on fiddling, manicuring, embroidering, and so forth. And by the time you're finished, you feel like, you know, writing is the loneliness of the long-distance runner in any case, because you're all by yourself, in contrast to the newsroom, where I also worked at the Washington Post. And you really feel drained, you know. You feel like you want to take a 3-year vacation, but you can't do that. You have to go on to your next book, right?
In Elsa Walsh's interview, you said something I'd like to have you start talking about here. And by the way, we're going to go to questions from you all if you have any very soon, so just kind of let me know. And there's a mic over here, and it would be very helpful if you could go to the mic. I know some people don't like to do that, but that way we can pick you up on both camera and audio. In talking about your interviewing, and you had the 3 women that you featured in your book, Rachel Warby, Meredith Vieira, and Alison Esterbrook.
A breast surgeon.
You said people tend not to tell the truth at first. And all 4 of you I know have interviewed. Would you expand on what you meant by that?
Well, when I said that people tend not to tell the truth when you first interview them, I wasn't meaning to say that they lie when they tell you things. It is often the case that most people don't really know what they think, and I sort of likened it, I don't know in my interview to you, but I liken it to myself as sort of a psychoanalytic process, which is that if you keep going back to a person and asking them similar questions and broadening it and going deeper, and that oftentimes the person will discover along with you a sort of a deeper truth in their life. One of the women in my book was the classical music conductor married to the governor of West Virginia for a very long time, had said to me during the course of our interviews that she didn't want to have a child. And as we began to talk over a period of a year, she in fact one day told me she had something very important to tell me, and she changed her mind about that and said, I asked her, why have you changed your mind? She said that talking to me had forced her to listen to herself. And I think it's something that Shakespeare had once described as kind of self-hearing. And when you're in an interview process, when you ask those questions again and again, people finally begin to self-hear and analyze what they've said and begin to ask themselves, is it true?
Did you tape record people?
I tape record almost all of my interviews and transcribe them because I find that I don't take notes quickly enough.
David Maraniss, when you did the book on Bill Clinton, you talked, at least in our interview, you talked about how you interviewed him 6 times during the campaign of '92. But when you went to the White House folks and said you wanted to interview him about the book, you never got one. And Mrs. Clinton said something to the effect, the lawyer said that he probably shouldn't do this. Would you want to expand on that and why you don't think he would sit for an interview?
The day after the election in '92, I actually talked to D.D. Myers and Stephanopoulos, two of Clinton's aides, and they said that the Clintons respect you and they'll likely do interviews for this book. And I was flying up to Little Rock to actually do my first book interview with Hillary Clinton when I got a call saying, don't come, they want to delay it, they want to think more about it. And then for the next year and a half, that process of sort of stringing me out like that went on, and it ended up that I never did get the interviews, although they never formally turned me down. And then after it was over, they said that it was because their lawyer, who I won't name, but anyway, their lawyer said, yeah, right, that's told them not to do the interviews with me because it might affect their memoirs, which is utterly ridiculous because, of course, people are going to buy their memoirs not because of anything that was in my book or not in my book, but because it's them. It's a celebrity book. It's not anything that they say. And that process continued even after my book came out, where I went back to reporting for the Washington Post, and I was covering the 1996 elections. And there were 3 times when I wanted to do interviews with President Clinton, and we were 3 reporters from the Post were going to go over to the White House to interview him before the convention in '96. And at the last minute, Mike McCurry, the press secretary then, called and said, well, you better not have Marinus come over. The president doesn't want to deal with those soul-searching questions that he'll ask. And then, so the other 2 reporters went to the White House and walked into the Oval Office, and President Clinton said, well, where's David? I haven't seen him in a long time. I'd really like to talk to him. I finally did meet the president again just a few months ago. I won an award, and I was on the dais at the American Society of Newspaper Editors convention, and President Clinton was the main speaker, and he had to go down the row and meet everybody, and the whole White House press corps was in the back of the room wondering what this occasion would be like when he finally shook my hand again. And it was great. It was classic Clinton. He walked by in his had the crutches then because his knee was hurt, and he shook my hand and said, David, congratulations, nice tie, and then moved on. And it was just...
Were you wearing a tie?
I usually don't. I was, but I've seen him mouth those words, nice tie, so many times. That's what he says.
Can I interrupt for 1 second? How do you think that the book would have changed had you been able to interview him the same way you've been able to interview him for the newspaper? Because sometimes when you get access to a very famous person, a person who's been interviewed a lot, you instead don't get very much, and it can hurt you at times.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, and I actually had mixed feelings the whole time that I was trying to get the interviews with him. And I tried to approach the biography, which was, I mean, it's a question even whether you can call something a biography about someone who's 46 years old at the time and is not dead. I mean, some people argue you shouldn't write one until someone is dead. But in any case, I tried to approach it as though my subject was not there. And I did get a lot of his letters and his voice from different parts of his life, and I think that was probably more important to me than getting those interviews where I would have had to deal with his take on his own life, which, as we all know, could be pretty colorful, but not necessarily accurate.
David, does he have someone like Edmund Morris sitting in there, the way Reagan did? You know, Edmund Morris was sat in the White House for 8 years. Is going to do the great Reagan book. I don't know how great it's going to be, but it's going to be the Reagan book.
He does not. He has a very great friend who's a great writer, who is Taylor Branch. But Taylor is just finishing his next book on Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, and really went to the White House several times to talk with President Clinton. And I know that the president would have loved to have had Taylor write that book. But I think it's lucky for Taylor that it didn't happen.
Stanley Carno, let me ask you the same question that we started with Elsa Walsh, because in your book on Vietnam and your PBS series, you did a lot of interviewing both for television and for your book. What about people when you interview them? Do they tend not to tell the truth at first?
Oh, and on Vietnam, there are great numbers of liars. There's no question about that. What we did, first of all, I covered the war for a long time. And so when I got to doing the interviews with people, you know, you learn as much as you bring to the subject. And if you come there with a good deal of knowledge and experience, and you've known these guys for a long time, you know, then you're kind of, it's much more congenial with them, even if you may be adversarial, but they know that you know something. It's not as if you're coming to them cold. The other thing about it is that when we did the interviews, when I did them for the book and the television series, it was several years after the war, and some of them were beginning to say things, reveal things that they didn't during the war when they were either in office as officials, and also because we began to dig up a lot of other material. So you would go to them and say, look, you said publicly such and such, but we know here's a confidential memo that came out in the Pentagon Papers or something, and while you said this publicly, you were saying something else privately, so let's come clean on it, of course, and they did. We did have some problems. McNamara, strangely enough, was the one person who refused to be interviewed, given what he finally did. And I remember, given the book that he wrote, this terrible book, I think, this Mea Culpa, you know, which was, in which he says, as you may remember, he says we were wrong, terribly wrong about the war, you know, and Max Cleland, who's lost both his legs and one of his arms, says the book should have been titled Sorry About That. You know, I mean, it's no quite consolation for people for McNamara to tell him it's wrong. At any rate, he refused to be interviewed, but for the most part, everybody did. And again, as I say, if you come to it with some knowledge and experience, I think we did pretty well. The toughest thing, and just the final, was at the time, we went to Vietnam in 1981, and it was really difficult because every time we interviewed some, let's say, a communist veteran or a soldier, he'd be surrounded with officials, and he would make his whole role in the war sound terribly heroic and so forth. If we went back and did it today, it would be much different because you're beginning to get Vietnamese communist enemy veterans writing the stories about in novel form or others, especially in novels, and they had a terrible time, just like our GIs did. And they're beginning to talk about how they smoked pot and they fragged their officers and they raped women and they deserted. We weren't getting that at the time, and but that's the way it is. We did it at that time, and we did the best we could at that moment.
Mr. Hitchens, in the Stanley Carno interview for Book Notes, he talked about how he got to do this book on Vietnam by laying on the beach in Nantucket with his friend Larry Grossman, who said, let's do a series on PBS on Vietnam. I bring that up because I want to ask you all about connections and whether or not in the book business that you're in, could you do what you're doing without connections?
I was laying on the beach in Nantucket is the first line of a limerick, isn't it?
You're not going to go on there.
There's a phrase that goes into
Nothing occurs to me when you ask about connections, Brian, because I'm published mainly by Verso, which is a small house. It's the publishing arm of New Left Review, which is a very good magazine, indeed, but with a fairly small circulation and not much what you might call a clout. Ancient loyalties are involved here. They will print stuff of mine that other publishers won't. I was going to tell you an interview story, though.
Please do.
If we weren't out of time on that.
We're not.
Well, what I've found is that amazing, if there's something you want someone to say and you think you can steer them into saying it, you think by your artful questioning you'll get it out of them, the thing that you're wanting to elicit, say. Very often they'll volunteer it. Maybe it's something desperate in your manner, I don't know, but to borrow another line, this one is the first line of the first column that Hillary Clinton ever wrote for her column series. The first line of the first column was, "The first time I met Mother Teresa." I knew then what kind of column we were in for from the First Lady. But the first time I met Mother Teresa, I walked around Calcutta with her and, followed her with dog-like devotion, feigning an interest in her work, because what I was pretty sure of was that we were up against here a fundamentalist campaigner who was cloaking her fundamentalist agenda in apparent humanitarianism. I thought that was probably the story, but I wasn't sure. And it was difficult to sort of frame a question that would disclose it. But I thought, well, we'll see. She took me around. We went to some tiny orphanage, I think it was, that she had going there. And when she'd finished showing me around, she said with a huge gesture of her arm, taking in the whole scene, you see, this is how we fight abortion and contraception in Bengal. This is what we do, and this is how, that's what we do, and this is how we do it. So I thought, no, that's really interesting. That's what I suspected she was doing, but it's very good of her to have volunteered it. And I've had that happen in a number of other cases too. The very thing that you feel that people are least likely to want to disclose is actually the thing that's nearest the front of their mind.
David Maraniss, how about connections?
Well, I think that undeniably the Washington Post is an important connection. It's a prestigious place to say you're from, and if you're covering politics in particular, I think it helps. Other connections, I think that I share with Elsa a connection to Bob Woodward, who's a close friend of mine. And he's always been very gracious in helping me and helped me not get any contracts with the book, but we have the same editor, and once in a while he's called the people up at Simon & Schuster and told them to treat me right.
Is that Alice Mayhew?
Yes. So those are two connections which, you know, I'm not ashamed of.
Elsa Walsh? Connections?
Oh, the tough question for me.
Well, it really is, Mr. Carno has to answer it too here in a moment.
Let
Go
me
ahead.
tell you, go ahead, Elsa.
Connections do help. They help in everything in life, of course. I think, as David points out, being with the Washington Post or being with the New Yorker or having friends or relationships with people who are in the book publishing or in the media world do help people. However, if you look at some of the surprise bestsellers in the last couple of years, The Liars Club by Mary Karr, a small poet up in New York, of The Perfect Storm, written by a man who was, I think, a tree cutter. There are books like that, Angela's Ashes, a high school teacher. So good work can percolate to the surface. It's harder to get attention, to get that initial sort of plug, but I also know many very famous people who complain incessantly about how poorly they were treated by their book publishers, that there weren't enough books published or shipped or not there on time. So it helps, but you still have to do the work.
Mr. Carno?
Well, I think it's, you know, if you've been around the circuit for a long time, you do have a lot of connections. I mean, I like to think that, you know, if you are an editor of the Harvard Crimson, as I was 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, and all those guys, or so many of those guys, spun off to become newspapermen, editors, publishers, and whatnot. And then you're in the newspaper business. You work for the Time Magazine, Life. I work for everybody. I can't hold a job. Then you get to know them. But the essential thing is that the connections are only as good as what they think your talent is. In other words, when Larry Grossman is lying on the beach with me in Nantucket and says, what about a television series on the Vietnam War, it's assumed that he thinks that I can do it. I mean, he just wouldn't walk down the beach and stop anybody and suggest it, right? So you've got to have a track record. The connections without the track record are useless. And today, I go out of my way to help kids or younger people. I call everybody kids, they're younger than I am, to get jobs and so forth. But I have to tell them that I think the letter of introduction, the reference, the phone call, that's not going to do you any good if you're really not any good, if you're not going to work at it. And I think that's the key to the whole thing. Sure, it's great, and we can't help but have contacts if you've been in this trade for a long time, but they're only as good as you are.
Anybody have a question they want to, if they've got anything, stand up at the mic and I'll go to it in just a second. We have a gentleman over here who's got one. Yes, sir, you're on. Right here? Right there.
Hi, what a tremendous group. I feel very lucky to have you all here. The two questions that come to mind to me, perhaps we could go down the line, is I'd like to know if there's a woman, perhaps a woman and a man, and perhaps both of you could think about that you interviewed that would be a good role model for our youngsters, perhaps girls to look up to and then boys to look up to. Also, professional sports have always interested me, how some athletes are so unapproachable, and then you have famous athletes like Cal Ripken, who, you know, love to sign 2,000 books. I was wondering perhaps if any of you can recall an athlete who really gave you a very good interview, and maybe some athlete that kind of gave you a hard time. Thank you very much.
Both David Marinus and Stanley Carno have done sports, written sports. Has Elsa Walsh, you ever written about sports?
No, not that I can think of.
Christopher Hitchens?
No, I've written about C.L.R. James, who was the great West Indian, great Trinidadian historian, who was also the greatest writer ever about the game of cricket. But that I've always found it's hard to get huddles to form to discuss cricket
What about
in Maryland.
What about why don't we start with you? What about a role model, either for a man or a woman, boy or a girl?
Without offense to the questioner, a role model is an expression I've come to detest, rather like icon or idol. They all seem to be running together now into this world of the vicarious coverage and vicarious existence. In fact, people wanting to lead virtual lives modeled on the lives of others. What depresses me about that is that just as it might be a good idea to have, let's say, someone who you thought of as an ideal figure who could inspire you, but the people who are held up as role models are simultaneously moved into a kind of stratosphere either of sainthood or celebrity where any normal reflective person would realize at once they wouldn't be able to follow them. Thus, no sooner is the idea proposed than it's moved out of their reach. Somebody mentioned Dr. King, or you mentioned Taylor's wonderful book about King. For example, it's always struck me as wonderful that, that's two wonderfuls, I hope I'll be forgiven. It's always struck me as impressive and moving that in Taylor's book and in other works on Dr. King, you can find out that he cheated on his exams, he probably plagiarized most of his doctoral thesis, he was a terrible fornicator, and so on, and traitor in his marriage, and so, because people think, well, I could do all that, and probably have done some of it, which means that therefore I could still maybe make a contribution to humanity, and I don't have to pass some ludicrous icon, idol, or role model test that would put me in the world of the narcissist and the robot, like say Diana Spencer.
Mr. Marinus?
That's, to some people, part of the attraction of President Clinton, too.
I can see how it could be a very powerful hold if properly exerted. Yes.
I share Christopher's. I don't hold the phrase role model in contempt, but I don't look at subjects that way. There are people that I like very much and some that I don't like very much, and it's not necessarily that they're role models or not. In writing about Vince Lombardi, there are some aspects of his character that I find terribly admirable. And yet, at the center of him, there's a real contradiction in that he sort of came to represent God, family, and the Green Bay Packers, and he always said it was in that order, and it wasn't at all. It was Green Bay Packers first and foremost. And at the same time that he was being held up by the establishment in the late 1960s as someone who represented order and discipline and responsibility. When my book comes out, you'll see that internally there were a lot of things going on there that contradicted that as well, and I think that's true of almost anyone that you study closely enough. The biggest thrill I've had in my career was spending a day with Muhammad Ali, and I'm sure that he has a lot of flaws in his life too, but that didn't matter to me. It was just so. He was so much fun and radiated. He just radiated something that was just delightful to be around him. And I sort of spent. It's the one time in my life that I asked someone for an autograph. As a reporter, I've never done that before. And he not only did an autograph for my son, but he drew little stick figures of a boxing ring and had Ali and Frazier in it. And it was just it was fantastic. So I think that's the one person I've interviewed that I'll never forget.
By the way, in our interview on Book Notes, you said you hadn't finally made up your decision whether to like or dislike Bill Clinton, and I got to ask you, it's a little bit late. It's a little bit later. Have you still not made up your mind?
Well, I'll still give the same answer. I mean, I think that
Well, if you liked him, we'd know by now.
Yeah, I think he's very predictive, and that even though my book ends the day he began his race for president, everything he's done since is in there. So that's all I'll say.
Elsa Walsh, what about the question?
Well, being the mother of a 14-month-old daughter, I'm a little less cynical these days than I used to be, and so the question about role models is one that doesn't offend me. I think two people who I interviewed quite a while ago as a reporter at the Washington Post for a series on public safety who impressed me very much were Ralph Nader, who is the great consumer activist, and a woman named Joan Claybrook, who is the head of something called Public Citizen, who is also a consumer activist. Two people who I think have dedicated their lives, sometimes perhaps in a way that I may not always agree with, but who have dedicated their lives to things that they believe in, haven't sold out, live pretty frugally, are committed.
How about a sports figure? Anybody there that...
I don't know. I hardly know any sports figures. I should think of some.
Mr. Carno?
On sports, I kind of gave up sports after being the sports editor of my high school newspaper. And the nail in the coffin was when the Dodgers left Brooklyn. That was the end for me. I've been going around trying to get a Dodgers baseball cap, but they all say L.A. on them. I couldn't do that. You know, as a reporter, I've gone from being a reporter to writing books. I mean, it's not much. It's the same thing, except the deadlines are different. But I think you instinctively shy away from getting too close to the people you're dealing with. I mean, there are a lot of people I admire, and some of them, some political figures have actually been close friends of mine, on the understanding that I'm going to be free to write about them as I please. One figure comes to mind, Ninoy Aquino, who was assassinated in August of 1983 and whose widow, Cory Aquino, became president of the Philippines. He and I were very close friends. And I had great admiration for him. He was a great swaggering figure. I mean, he was just swashbuckling, marvelous guy. And I used to write about him occasionally, and I remember saying to him one time, Ninoy, I'm going to write about you, but mind you, I'm going to write about you warts and all, right? You may not like it, and he took that old Hollywood line, just spell my name right, and everything will be okay. So I can think of other people that I've admired. Senator Fulbright, for example, is one, at least the late Fulbright, not the Tonkin Gulf Fulbright. And in this book in Paris, Mendes France, who was a prime minister in 1954, and others I could go through, that I got to know and admired. But again, you want to keep a certain distance, I think, from public figures.
Do we...
sorry.
Yeah.
Not if I'm in anyone's way.
Let me just ask those...
I was left holding the cynic's baton there for a second.
Hold on just a second. I want to... If somebody has another question, why don't you go on up to the mic and then go ahead. Did you want to add something?
Well, I mean, I wasn't asked who had I met who I thought was cool. I was asked about the role model thing.
Well, Christopher, who have you met that you thought was cool?
So that I don't seem just to be the cynic, though my daughter is getting older, which does make one more cynical, by the way. I should say journalism is a wonderful profession. I mean, it's given me the opportunity to be photographed with Nelson Mandela, which is like you. I mean, I don't usually want these photographs for the grand piano. I don't have a piano, for one thing, but I did really want a photographic record of that handshake, very much. And I've met Václav Havel and other people who one is, so to speak, given little choice but to admire. And I was amazed to find, these people are not only good, they're as good as people say that they are, and good in the way you expected them to be as well, almost irritating, but also very inspiring and confirming. But by no means a role model for all those reasons. These are people who you couldn't very well model yourself upon. I think it may be dangerous to suggest this to people. In my own profession, and so I never miss the chance of mentioning, if I'm given it, the person I'm most proud to know is Salman Rushdie, and it's really ridiculous to say we're in the same profession, but it's been a great honor for me to know him before and during, and I like to think since, the fatwa. because I think the fight was being defeated now. Because I think it's a great honor to know someone whose only action has been writing, whose only commitment has been to the craft of writing, who would by now have been a Nobel laureate, I believe, for his writing if it wasn't for this, and will be in any case. And to have the combination of the greatest issue in the world, namely free expression, with one of the greatest authors in the world is a tremendous thing. And it's all done just by the pen.
Yes, sir.
An unsolicited testimonial for Book Notes. I was supposed to go to the book festival here in Baltimore early in September. Got the flu or cold, stayed home with your book, and I wish it had gone on 500 more pages. I recovered fairly swiftly, but I wish there'd been more to keep me company. If anybody cares at all about books, this is just a wonderful companion. And now the question, what role, positive or negative, have your editors played in the final product? Are they better, noticeably, because of the editor? Are they relatively no factor? Are they not as good as you had wished they had been, but for the editor's involvement?
Mr. Carnot?
Well, I think that every writer needs an editor. Every writer's writing can be improved by a good editor. But many writers' work can be devastated by a lousy editor. And so, you know, what you've got to do is find yourself a good editor to start with. I'm talking about books now. And if you get one, stick with them and count your blessings you got one. Just one point, and I think my colleagues might agree with me. Books are being less and less edited today because editors, for the most part, are deal makers. That is, they sign the contract, and I sometimes suspect that in many cases the editor may not even read my manuscript, or if he did, it was just once over lightly. In other words, you know, the book business, or as to quote this piece of the New Yorker recently, they now call it the book industry, has become just that, you know, and the editors, I was very fortunate to have a young editor on this book who was very attentive and very good. But I really think a good editor is terrific and very important to you, and I welcome a good editor. I won't talk about newspaper editors, that's another matter. When I worked at the Post, we used to call it creative tension when you had to deal with editors. But anyway, I passed to Elsa and others.
Let me just make a comment, because the editor of the Book Notes book, Jeff Chandler, is the same editor of Stanley Carnot's book, and I can tell you, in our case, we would have been in real trouble without Jeff Chandler. He did a great job and a very active job and had a lot to do with giving us direction. Elsa Walsh?
Well, I think writing is a cooperative process, and just as all writing, good writing is rewriting, all good rewriting involves a good editor. It doesn't always have to be the editor that is assigned to you. In my particular case, when I was writing my book, I had 3 different editors, all of whom contributed something to it, but I think that the 2 people who helped me the most in editing my book were my husband, who's also a writer, and a researcher that we had working for us at that time. I think that without them, my book would have been much sloppier, less tighter. I agree with Stanley that most editors don't have the kind of time that you might want, particularly as a first-time author, as I was, to sit there and hold your hand and go through something page by page and really talk about it.
Mr. Maris?
I have sort of contradictory feelings about editors in the first place. I give a speech to reporters called How to Stay One Step Ahead of Your Editors, and I've really tried to spend my entire career at the Washington Post developing my own ideas and thoughts and letting the paper accept those. But book editing is a different process entirely, and I was very lucky in that my parents sort of came out of retirement, first of all, to edit my book, and then Alice as well. But it is a different process, and there's really less editing in a book than the average person would realize, I think.
I'll also do a little bit of disclosure for David. David was an editor at the Washington Post for a while and was thought probably to be the best editor there at the time. People really clamored to work for him, and I think that was because you got very involved in people's processes, but you also did something that many editors don't do, which is that you would talk out a story before it was written.
Let's go to Christopher Hitchens, and we'll come back to Stanley Carno wants to add something. Mr. Hitchens?
The United States is an over-edited culture, and the prestige of the editor is too high here, in my opinion, in publishing and in journalism too. The job of an editor really ought to be simply to find people who can write and empower or enable, two other words I don't like, them to get on with it, so people will get my drift. I've been very lucky in having editors like that in the magazine business. Victor Nowacki at The Nation, for example, and Graydon Carter at Vanity Fair are tremendously good at and have been very good, and Katrina Vanden Heuvel too, and simply deciding what they think one is good at, and trying to find occasions where one could do that bit. I think, though, in book writing, there are only two observations I'd add. One, the editor edits best who edits least, and two, it's good to have an editor who either wants to be or has been themselves a writer. And I was very lucky in that respect when I did my work for Farrar, Straus and Giroux to have David Reef as an editor. I think you've interviewed, have you not? You certainly have seen him on C-SPAN.
We've had him on. I have not interviewed him,
I know he's not in your book, but I mean, he's a
No, I did interview him on a morning show once, yeah.
You did?
Not on the book
I thought
show.
I'd seen you together, as it were.
No, he was on.
Well, anyway, to have someone who was himself a very, as well as being a tremendously good reader, I mean, someone who, I think that, I meant to say this earlier, so I'll say it now, the compulsion to read is not unlike the compulsion to write. People who feel they must be good readers, and that reading is something they have to do and must do, and they want to refine it. It's not just a leisure activity, it's an activity of its own. Will often make good writers, they'll certainly make good editors, I think.
Mr. Carno?
Well, one thing I do, and it's a form of editing, is to pass my manuscript around to several people, friends. It's not always a good thing to do because they tend to be too kind to you. And they tend to tell you it's great when and that's comforting in a way. The really tough editor, apart from the real editor, is my wife, who did the illustrations for the book. And this is, again, part of what I call creative tension. She'd read the manuscript and say, well, this is not clear. And then I'd scream at her, what do you mean it's not clear? It's a perfect... And then I think, if she doesn't think it's clear, it's probably not clear, right? So go back and rewrite it. And that, you have to have, I guess a wife is, or a maid of some sort is as good as the best editor you can have, because she or he can be really honest with you. And you know, and then, of course, you boil up like overheated milk, and then it cools down a bit, and you have dinner.
Is there another question ready in the audience? Anybody have a question? If you think of one, please go up to the mic. I've got a couple more things I'll throw in the pot here. From our interview, Mr. Hitchens, on Book Notes, you said, I think that hatred, though it provides often rather junky energy, is a terrific way of getting you out of bed in the morning. I'd like to ask all of you about hatred, anger, and writing, and whether or not you ever do it together. Mister, you want to expound on that? Are you a hater?
They say you never forget your first love. I can remember my first hate, journalistic hate, with real vividness, and the feeling that it was a strong motivator to write. It wouldn't be an interesting one to share with you, but I can remember it very well, and it's how I learned an important distinction. Many people feel that, and many people in fact are fond of saying, that it's more important to generate light than heat. You may have heard this wised-up remark made by people. It sounds so judicious, doesn't it? Poppycock, of course. I mean, there's no other source of light but heat. Where else could light come from but heat, if you think about it? Totally false distinction. Just like the people who say that if you're strongly motivated, or if you have an investment of that kind in a subject, that you won't be detached or objective about it. I think that's quite untrue too. You can be in a rage and be perfectly cold and controlled. At least you should aim to be. I spend most of my time in an extremely bad mood, and I hope it shows. Hoping really just to deprive people of whatever happiness they may be able to get from living with their illusions. Also, I have the arrogance to say what I think the illusions may be, you know. Usually it's the comforting ones. Sometimes it's illusions about individuals, like the woman styling herself Mother Teresa, for example. I think people shouldn't be allowed to just go around thinking, oh, thank heavens someone's looking after the poor, when they are not, or aren't proposing to, and they're not interested enough in finding out that she's not doing it either. I think, okay, I'll correct that. It makes me cross that there's so much complacency around. I think, I have a feeling in my, this is from memory, but I think we may have been talking about Dr. Kissinger when that came up.
He was in the interview, yes.
I check to see if I have a pulse every day. I check to see if certain things still annoy me. Does the New York Times still have that moronic thing on its front page saying all the news fit to print? Yes, it does. Do they not know the difference between a tautology and, oh, never mind, forget it, they're still there. Does the Washington Post still publish that ludicrous horoscope section? Yes, they're still doing it. And is there anything by Henry Kissinger in the paper today? And is he described as a mediator or as the chairman of Kissinger Associates or as anything but what I believe him to be? And has anyone ever asked him, you know, have you ever found a country that's better off for your attentions than it was when you found it? And things like that.
Elsa Walsh, have you ever written from anger or hatred?
I want to say something first. I interviewed a psychiatrist a couple of weeks ago who said that she works at St. Elizabeth's, and she said that one of the first signs that they see that somebody is getting mentally well is that they have a sense of humor, because it signifies an ability to think of the abstract. So I think you must be the sanest person in this in this building. I don't write from hatred, and that's probably, I mean, I feel like Pollyanna here. I write, injustice moves me as a reporter, and that is probably the thing that I find most motivating when I'm was as a newspaper reporter.
And in the Three Lives book, the Divided Lives, and the three people that you wrote about, was there the injustice thing there with the three of them?
Well, there wasn't a sense of injustice with that. What I was trying to get to there was a sense of why things weren't working out for these women, but for women of my generation and their generation, why there was a sense of sort of frustration and imbalance in their lives. And so injustice perhaps, but more a sense of sort of distress.
Mr. Carno, were you ever angry during the Vietnam book?
Well, I try not to be angry. What I think I tried to do was to convey how I felt by illustrating illustrating a case. I'll give you an example. When and I use that in the book, when General Westmoreland would go out, we'd go out after battle, and you see these piles of enemy dead, which they call it the body count. It's a gruesome term. And he'd say something like, well, you know, life doesn't mean the same thing to Asians as it does to him, to us, I mean, to us in the West. And then you'd write that, right? And maybe if you had and I've done this with him actually, and you say, what about the Battle of Antietam, you know, where 50,000 Americans were killed in one day, or the Battle of the Somme in 1916, where, I don't know how many, Christopher, how many, 100,000 British troops were killed in one day.
Well, 60,000 before lunchtime on the, first day of the battle, the first day of the Battle of the Somme.
A large number. At any rate, so instead of sort of slamming my fist on the table and getting indignant and saying what an unprintable General Westmoreland is, tell the story and let the reader make the deduction from the story rather than get yourself wrapped up in a lot of angry adjectives, which in fact will deflate the story.
Mr. Marinus.
I stand in awe of people like Christopher who can turn their anger into humor. I can't do that.
Crying inside.
It seems like the only person I get angry at is myself. I have a sense of trying to understand everybody else in humanity except myself, so I tend to beat on myself about what I think, but have never really written out of anger. I do get angry at people who abuse power, and I tend to be most skeptical about people who are on top and more sympathetic toward those who are on the bottom. But it rarely crosses over into real hatred.
Let me just ask one more question about the Bill Clinton situation. Did it make you angry when he wouldn't give you an interview for the book? And would that ever show up in?
Well, it would in very superficial ways. I mean, I would be angry if I saw him talking to some schmuck somewhere and not to me, or posing for some photograph or being with celebrities. I mean, that's where my real anger comes out, at the whole celebrity.
You could have been on the videotapes with him.
Yeah. In other words, he would talk to somebody who really eviscerated him if that person were more sexy or famous than I was. But I was treating him fairly, and he wouldn't deal with me, and that really did upset me.
Question from our audience.
Well, my question is about anger also. Several people today have praised Angela's Ashes and Mary Carr's Liars Club, and I wanted to ask the authors, and perhaps Brian Lamb too, what do they make of the recent backlash against memoir writing? And last Sunday's New York Times, there was a review by Peter Kramer in which he was furious about the memoir that he was reviewing. So, what do you make of it?
What was the memoir?
It was an empty lap about a woman's, a Time magazine reporter and her husband's struggle with infertility, and then their efforts to adopt an Asian baby.
Might add to that question whether or not any of you read a good memoir or any memoir that you want to bring up along with answering the question.
Well, I'm the one who brought up Mary Carr, The Liars Club, which I read very quickly, and for the first couple of chapters, I was quite sort of captivated by it, and just thought, this is fascinating. This writing, she was writing in the voice of initially, I think, a 4-year-old girl, and then she traced it up until about the age of, I guess, her late teens, early 20s. And after about 4 chapters, I stopped for a moment and took a deep breath and said to myself, well, how does she remember all of this stuff? Because there's all these long quotes. She can't keep a diary when you're 4 or 5 years old. And so I became angry with that book, even though I found it quite fascinating. I found it, in the end, dishonest.
Mr. Marinus.
I think you have to read most memoirs as fiction and not nonfiction. I don't think they're quite memoirs, but I love George Orwell's writings, and some of his greatest essays are about his personal experiences. I think his little essay on a hanging in Burma is one of the great essays of all time.
George Orwell.
Yeah.
I wrote a quote down, by the way, from Mr. Christopher Hitchens' interview. My favorite radical journalist in history is George Orwell.
Mine too. And Laurie Lee, who's another British writer, I think has written some great personal experiences about Spain. Yeah.
What do you think of memoir in general?
I tend not to read it. I mean, because I think of it as fiction. And so my wife has read both of those books, Liars Club and Angela's Ashes, and liked them both very much, and I haven't read either one.
While we're asking, define what you think a memoir is, or you believe it to be.
Well, I think it starts with someone's impression of themselves, or what they would like to be, or what they think they experience. But I think it's more the internal imagination, really, than the real experience of their life.
What's the difference between an autobiography and a memoir?
Well, sorry.
No, go ahead. You probably don't
look, everyone has a book inside them, which is exactly where I think it should, in most cases, remain. And I think that I was wondering who would be the first to launch a counterattack to this current tendency of solipsism, of people saying, why don't you just tell everything you can remember, and what you can't remember we can recover or retrieve from you with a decent agent. Thinking enough already with that, this solipsistic, this extension of the me decade, narcissism really, fitting all too well with the exterior-dominated celebrity culture that we talked about already a bit. But that, I think, would be at the expense of some well-wrought stuff. You asked for recent examples. I reviewed for the Los Angeles Times the other day, in the course of a series of books about Armenia, the memoir of a young reporter called Peter Balakian. It was a sort of Armenian roots voyage about his family in New Jersey. It was called The Black Dog of Fate. but it turned into an investigation of the buried history of Armenia and what happened to its people, and justified itself very brilliantly, I thought, in that way. He had been lucky in having an aunt who was an editor at the New York Times Book Review, so my review, it turned out, was pretty much superfluous. But I haven't read Angela's Ashes, but from what I gather, I do know the brother of the author, who used to be a barman friend of mine in San Francisco, which is where I do most of my research, is not San Francisco, the bar, I mean. And it seemed to me that this was justifiable as a revisiting of the idea of, you know, how good is it to have religion and family values totally dominating your upbringing.
Mr. Carno?
Well, I want to preface it by saying when you're working on a book, you don't read very much, except the stuff that you're using for your book.
By the way, is yours a memoir?
Well, I'll get to that. I'll get to the third point. I will, though, in the middle of relaxing from work, and by the way, the best form of relaxation for me is crossword puzzles. I'm addicted to crossword puzzles. But I have been reading or rereading Justin Kaplan's biography of Mark Twain, which I hope is still in print. It's just a superb book, and you can really learn a lot about writing and America and the 19th century and a lot of other things from that. Is this a memoir? I call this a chronicle. Everyone's dumping on memoirs, so I got to get out of the way here. It is essentially, it's a part memoir in the sense that I have to tell about how I got to Paris when I was 22 years old, and how I got my job at Time magazine as a spear carrier and eventually became a correspondent. But that's the beginning of it. And after that, it's a series of chronicles of different aspects of Paris, life in Paris, mostly about the French, actually, with the exception of that thing I mentioned earlier, a few interviews with Audrey Hepburn, Hemingway, the Duke of Windsor, and so forth, but most of it about the French. So I like to call it a chronicle. It's going to be called a memoir. In fact, I went into a bookstore to see if they had it the other day. It was on the fiction shelf. But people can call it whatever they want.
I'm surprised you say that about Kaplan's book on Twain, because I know you're very interested in the Philippines and have written a lot about it. And there isn't even a chapter in that book about Twain's stand, famous and brilliant, and misunderstood and underreported.
That's true.
Stand on the Philippine War.
I did look on that, and Sitting in Darkness was the famous thing that Twain wrote. Yeah, he overlooked it. But I think, nevertheless, I mean, it's still a big book, and I think it's a marvelous book.
We're getting down near the end. I want to give. You had a question? Yeah. Well,
you could talk about book reviews and how you react to how your books have been reviewed, especially if you agree with any critical aspects.
Well, you always sort of say it doesn't matter, although I can tell you that some do stick in your craw, and they come up, the sort of the bad reviews you can almost repeat word by word by word. And when Princess Diana was killed in early September, one of my first reactions was, and I hate to admit this about myself because it really is so narcissistic, was to get very angry at a review which had said, reading my book and trying to learn about a marriage was for the average person trying to learn about marriage from Princess Diana and her marriage to Prince Charles. And I thought to myself, well, see, she was wrong, because all these women are really interested in what's happened to Princess Diana. And then I stepped back for a minute and I thought, you are really insane.
Is it better to be reviewed badly rather than not at all?
No, without doubt. There are some authors who claim they never read their reviews. For some reason, most of the authors I've heard make this claim are female. I don't know if that's coincidence or not. In the case of Doris Lessing, who I once heard claim that she doesn't bother to read her clips, I believed her. In the case of the others, I didn't, if only because in one case, Margaret Drabble, I heard her denouncing a review to a different person later on in the same evening as having been grossly unfair. The experience that I alluded to earlier of having a close friend who wrote a work of fiction, a beautiful work of fiction, that posed the question of whether Holy Writ could or not be used for, could or could not be used for literary purposes, and then read in the paper the next day that he'd been sentenced to death and a large sum of money raised to encompassed this killing, suborned this murder for money by a clerical leader, has meant that I've never felt like complaining about any response to anything I've written ever since.
David Maris?
The worst review in history.
I did read all the reviews, and some hurt and a lot felt great, but the difficult part for me was my subject and the time when my book came out, when everybody had extremely strong feelings one way or the other about Clinton, and there were so many rumors around about him, and Whitewater was coming out, and the sex stories and everything, so that I think it was harder for people to focus on a serious biography than on some of the other splashier, irresponsible books that came out around the same time, and that's probably what stuck in me more than the reviews.
Is there another question from the audience? Yes.
Yeah. I'm not sure you covered this already, but I hope if you have, I apologize. There's been some publicity lately about how much of a rarefied air it is to get on the bestseller lists of particular publications and newspapers, and the relationship between that and being successful at selling books. I've seen very popular books get to the remainder table pretty quickly, but others not. And I'm wondering, because your books, as I would understand, are bestsellers pretty quickly, but also over time, what you feel about the book publishing business that makes it so much of a chance to, you spend a year or two writing this book and you don't make it to the New York Times bestseller list, then what?
Let me ask on that question to Stanley Carno, how long did you work on your Paris book? And
I worked on this I knocked off in 2 years. That's nothing. I did a book on, but don't forget, you say how long? I mean, there's 50 years of research, right? I mean, I was using material I've been I did a book on China back in 1972, which was also based on 11 years as a correspondent based in Hong Kong and in China. Vietnam, the same thing. It took me 7 or 8 years to do that, and one on the Philippines took a long time. I mean, the first thing I think, and maybe people from the bookstore can answer this question better than I can, but I've discussed it with the publisher. I discussed it with the president of Random House the other day, Harry Evans, if I can drop a name. What sells books? They don't know. I mean, they don't know what is the magic that makes a book a bestseller or not. When I did my book on the Vietnam War and submitted the manuscript to the first publisher, he said it read like a sophomore term paper and broke the contract. And then I went on to another publisher, to Viking, and by Christmas it had been on the bestseller list steadily. And so much for the first publisher, who was a seasoned veteran. I mean, they just don't. Nobody seems to know, unless there's some secret that I don't know. I've gotten great reviews for books that sank to the bottom of the sea. The whole reviewing process is a strange one. Susan reminded me of I got a very good review the other day in the Post, and I like to get good reviews. Let's not bandy this around. We're not above all this stuff, Dr. Johnson once said that nobody except a blockhead writes except for money, and we all want to be successful and make money out of books. But I got one in Publishers Weekly, a pre-publication review, said the trouble with these memoirs is that they're dated. And I was crestfallen for a while.
The Dr. Johnson quote, by the way, is in the 1989 interview that I did with Mr. Carno, so he's held on to that for a long time.
He's one of my great heroes.
Mr. Marinus?
I thought you interviewed Dr. Johnson.
Please.
I could have.
Well, I confess, probably like most writers, I get depressed when I look at the bestseller lists often, at what's there, and it boggles my mind on why people buy certain books and not others. But I try to block it totally out of my mind during the whole process that I'm writing a book. And so I don't even want to talk about it now. I just want to focus on the book I'm working on and see what happens when it's done. But if you start thinking about, you know, what could you put into the book that will sell it or not, then you're destroying your own integrity. So.
Elsa Walsh?
Well, I mean, there's not really much more to add to this except to say that it's quite foolish to try to hope when you're writing your book that it's going to be on the bestseller list, because there's really, there's no sort of telling.
And the last word for this event here today will come from Christopher Hitchens.
There's a wonderful poem, if you can get it in an anthology of his poems, by Clive James. It's called "The Book of My Enemy Has Been Remaindered." I recommend it to everybody. I have it pinned up above my typewriter. Look, there are certain ways, there are certain small vengeances you can get. None of my books have made anything you could call money, or certainly approached any kind of a list. One of them once got on a list of 10 not very well-selling books that should have sold better, that was done by a magazine in London called Time Out, so Losers Top 10. I still have the clip of that somewhere. And I'm pleased with this little book I've done on Cyprus here, because when I decided that there should be a book on Cyprus, and there's a need for one, this is some years ago now, in 1984, my agent, my publisher, everyone told me no one will read it, no one will buy it, no one will publish it. And this is its third reprinting, if I do say it myself, very modest, but it does tell, if anyone's interested, and they should be, what happened to the martyred people of that island, and why it's still a very dangerous situation. And I'm proud of having sort of stood over it. Peter de Vries, who here reads Peter de Vries? Anybody? He's a very good...
Not anymore.
Well, minor novelist, I think, is the term, probably. Good minor American novelist, New Yorker writer. He could make you laugh, he could make you cry. He wrote a very wonderful tragic novel called The Blood of the Lamb, about the death of a child, which I think would almost certainly make anyone who was a mammal weep when they're reading it. And a very funny novel called Mackerel Plaza, extremely great comic writer. And he was once interviewed. I'll give him the last word. And he said, he was asked, what are your ambitions as a writer, Mr. de Vries? And he said, well, my ambitions as a writer are to have a mass audience for my writing, a mass audience that is large enough for my elite audience to despise. I realized then that I'd found my role model.
Thanks to Susan Weiss and Biblos for doing all this on a Sunday afternoon, especially for you all for coming out on a rainy day. Nice to be with you.
If anybody has or would like a book signed, please, you can make a line sort of down the aisle. You can make a line and come up and meet the authors. If you have a question for them that you'd like to ask, I'm sure that'd be fine too. And Brian Lamb would also be happy to autograph a book notes for you. Thank you all for coming. Okay, let's get you up here. Let's get everybody seated for a second.
What may I call you? He says, what may I call you?